So, welcome everyone to USAID's session on the top 10 things that you should know about youth and USAID and economic opportunities. My name is Maryanne Yerkes. I am currently, normally I'm in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center, but I'm also serving as the interim youth coordinator for the agency. So I'm in that role for now. So that's what I will be speaking to you about. And my colleagues will introduce themselves, but very quickly, Clare Ignatowski and Kristin. But we have a gift for you today. You don't only get the 10 top things, you'll probably get more than 10. So you can select from those. So you're going to get a lot of information from us in an hour. And I'll start out with some of the higher level issues related to USAID and the youth policy. And then Claire will take that down to more specifics related to what we're doing in relation to this conference in particular. And then Kristin will also kind of tell you about some of the key challenges and questions that she and her team and others are looking into in the area of youth and economic opportunities. So to start out with, I would say that one of the top things you should know is that we have a youth and development policy. How many of you have read that policy? Raise your hand. Yeah? If I were to ask you the objectives, would you be able to tell me what they are? I won't test you on that. I have a few here in front of me on the desk, only a few because unfortunately they go really, really quickly. They're also, the policies on our website, you can find that. But just briefly for those of you who are not familiar with the policy, our overarching goal is to improve the capacities and enable the aspiration of young people so that they can contribute to and benefit from more stable, democratic, and prosperous communities. And then the two objectives are quite broad as well. The first one is really to look at how we can strengthen and improve our youth programming, participation and partnership in support of our broader development objectives, but basically to strengthen our youth programs. And the second is how can we integrate youth into our broader efforts? How can we integrate young people, mainstream youth into our work? And also how can we elevate youth voice in our efforts? So that's kind of the first thing, to know that we have a policy. The second main point, which you're probably curious about, is to know where we are with policy implementation. So first of all, I also want to mention that while we did release and launch the policy last fall, as many of you know, USAID has been operating in this space and working with youth for a very long time. So the policy was important because it elevated the issue, and it gave a lot of people that were working on youth already kind of the support, I'd say, from the agency to work more intensively on this issue. So that's important to note. So since the launch of the policy, we've been very busy in trying to socialize the policy both within the agency and with external communities, meeting and talking about the policy, trying to do trainings when we're out at missions, informing the bureaus, et cetera. So there's been a heavy emphasis on socializing the policy. In addition to that, we pulled together an interagency team that represented the different bureaus in the agency to kind of look at what does policy implementation mean. So kind of to work through some of the challenges that we as an agency face in working on youth issues and to identify what are our core priorities for moving this policy forward. And a number of you have engaged with us, have asked us very appropriately what's going on with the policy, sending letters, et cetera, and ensuring that you hold us accountable. And so that's all been helpful for keeping this issue as high on the radar at the agency as possible. And again, I'm a civil society supporter in my DRG, Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance role, so I do think that that's very helpful. So this team has been working on developing kind of a draft action plan, if you will, that would highlight some of the key areas that we need to work on within the agency, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But it's also important to note that at the field level, our missions continue to work in this space. So they continue to support youth programming. Some missions are looking at innovative approaches for integrating youth across the development portfolio. How can you do this generally at the mission level? So that work is continuing. What I'll focus on now, and what I started to focus on, is what we're doing at the agency level. So one of the key pieces, in addition to the action plan, which I'll address in just a minute, some of the main elements of that, and also get your feedback on, is the youth coordinator position. So obviously I'm the interim coordinator, but I'm also interim, and I'm also wearing multiple hats. So one of our top priorities right now is to move forward with having the youth coordinator appointed. So that's like a real top priority for us, and moving that piece forward. And then in addition to that, we're also looking at how else do we need to organize within the agency to move this agenda forward. We have a number of young people in different bureaus. I mean, not, well, young people, yes, but people working on youth in different bureaus. So we're trying to better organize ourselves to advance this issue. Within the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, we've created kind of a nascent youth and dacha community of practice, and there are other efforts to kind of pull together our work in this space. And that includes, if you've read the policy, looking at issues such as bureau points of contact, office points of contact, et cetera. We are also looking at reinvigorating our existing intra-agency youth working group and moving that piece forward. In terms of the action plan, just to touch on, again, we have a draft action plan, and so the points that I'll mention are just draft. We are still needing the support of our agency leadership on that, and we'll probably reach out more formally to get a bit more feedback from people such as yourselves on the pieces. But just to touch on very briefly some of the main components, there'd be a component of looking at kind of assessing a baseline, developing a baseline of where we are, so in terms of what kind of funding we have for youth, you know, the number of evaluations that we're working on, et cetera. So kind of looking at what exists and get a better sense of that. If any of you know our system, it's very hard to do that. So we're looking at what can we do within USAID to kind of move that piece forward. Also, monitoring and evaluation, there's a heavy emphasis on that and saying that there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge. And Clare will talk about some of the work that's been going on in that space with regards to youth and economic opportunities. So that's a heavy focus. Working on advancing our learning agenda as well. You'll see it and hear about it in terms of different sectors. So Clare will talk about the learning agenda specific to this topic, but we're also looking at that across the agency. Where are some of the key issues, areas that we need to put additional focus on? So again, if you have ideas, please reach out to us. My cards will be up here on the table. You probably have your own contacts. We're very open to your feedback in these areas. Another key component of our work is technical guidance. So the way it's been working within USAID, we have a lot of policies, as some of you may know, that have come out, and we have how-to notes. Don't you love that? How-to note. So we'll be working on a how-to note on the youth and development policy, and then there's other guidance that has been or is being developed. Our global health colleagues have developed some draft guidance on integrating youth into the health space. Colleagues in the Europe and Eurasia Bureau are working on guidance and toolkits related to youth integration and programming as well. So you'll hear about this, and depending on the area, we'll be reaching out to people as well for feedback. We've also been really looking at how can we help people understand this issue. Youth and development, everyone says youth is really important, and of course, but a lot of times people say, well, what does that mean? So one proposal that we as a group have, and I mean as a group, that's the interagency team that's been working on the action plan and implementation, is maybe we can demonstrate or model in a few countries what does effective implementation look like. So thinking of something like champion missions, I don't want to promote that term, but the idea is really, are there a few places where missions, USAID missions and partners are doing some really innovative work with youth, and can we help to kind of expand that or enhance that to demonstrate to other USAID missions and countries, how do you do effective youth development, holistic programming? And then also just to mention that there's a focus on youth participation. That's a heavy part of the policy, is how can we kind of strengthen youth voice within our work. So we are collaborating with our colleagues at the Department of State. We'll be having more conversations with them concerning the youth councils. You may be familiar with those at certain embassies around the world. They have youth councils. We'll be talking to them about that. Clare will mention some work in her bureau in that area of youth engagement. And there are also some high-level initiatives that you may have heard about at the agency level in terms of President Obama's Young African Leadership Initiative, looking at how we can support young African leaders. There's the Higher Education Solutions Network effort as well, which Clare will touch on. So there's a lot of work going on at that level in terms of engaging young people. There have been campus challenges in different areas too, and looking at how university students can engage in our work. So I'll close here because this is, again, the high level, broad. It's more interesting for you for the specific, but we are very much collaborating with other donors, exploring opportunities to develop joint learning agendas, looking at other ways to raise the issue of youth in terms of post-2015 discussions, et cetera. So we are working closely with these partners and would welcome ideas. If there are key gaps that you see from where you operate in terms of donor collaboration, donor work in this area, we do welcome your suggestions and want to help advance this agenda. So with that, I will pass the mic to Clare. And if we'll hold the questions till the end, since this is kind of a smooth transition, hopefully.
Yes, thank you. So we're kind of going through a number of things in a staccato type method, and that gives you a chance to eat, and then hopefully by the time you're done and Kristin lays out some of the challenges we're working on, then we'll be able to have more discussion. I'd like to just talk about two main levels. One is some broad direction. I guess, did you introduce me exactly?
Just your name.
Because I never pay attention to that stuff. Just for those that don't know me, I'm located in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and the Environment in the Office of Education, and I work on workforce development and youth issues. Clare, Ignatowski. So I would just want to mention some broad directions and then some activities and projects that we're working on kind of at the global level. In terms of broad directions, Maryanne has mentioned the youth policy. We also have our education strategy. How many people are familiar with the ED strategy? Okay, a lot, like sort of half, almost half. One of the goals within the ED strategy is goal 2. We have 3 goals. We just call them by their numbers a lot of times for shorthand, and that is it discusses higher education and workforce development. And so we've really sort of worked hard to prioritize and focus on youth workforce development. And we'll be raising the visibility of this area of work, especially to bring it up to the level of the other 2 goals, which are in early grade reading and then education in conflict-affected regions. And we'll be involved in sort of a branding exercise. So hopefully many of you will participate in that part. And also we're working too on the linkages across goals. So particularly in the area of education and conflict, many people don't realize, but there are a lot of workforce development activities occurring with that, and it is absolutely, that area of work is open for business in the area of youth. It's not just early grade. We have, last year I think we presented one of our 3 state-of-the-field reports, or maybe we presented all 3, I don't quite remember. One of them is in youth workforce development, one is in cross-sectoral holistic approaches to youth development, and one is in education and conflict. They're kind of extended literature reviews. They're available publicly. We did a Twitter chat on them a couple months ago. And hopefully you're using those as you're preparing projects and reviewing the sort of what is the evidence base in this area of work. We're also working on developing a research agenda out of those reports, particularly, well, in all 3 areas, but including the youth workforce development area. And we'll be talking to other donors about their research agendas and seeing where we have some common areas of common interest, so we can begin to kind of consolidate our evidence. We are working, we have increased collaboration between education and economic growth, and that's been one of the hallmarks of this conference really for the entire length of time that it's been around. You'll be hearing from an economic growth perspective in a minute. So, and that will hopefully be able to, we're thinking about working more in diagnostics to take a more comprehensive approach to youth employment and really begin to pay more attention to identifying what some of the constraints to employment are in different countries and in different regions, and rather than just kind of falling back, as you know we tend to do, on tried and true intervention types, regardless of the particular constraints in that country. And that's going to take both sides of the brain to think. When I say brain, I mean the supply and demand side. And then in terms of broad directions, we're focusing, we're starting to deepen our knowledge in systems thinking. There's a lot of discussion about complexity, and we know the whole field of youth economic opportunity and workforce development is all about complexity. So we understand that there is quite a robust field of systems thinking and systems work. And so actually internally we'll go through a training across sectors in systems thinking, and hopefully we can pull that, expand that, and offer that more broadly. And then in terms of sort of products or activities, some of these may be occurring under something we call the Workforce Multiplier Award. And we're looking to develop a youth workforce development learning network, but not creating more networks than we need, but connecting it to existing portals and networks that already exist. But really kind of bringing together a lot of important evaluations and knowledge products. So that will be probably over the next 2 years. And then in terms of building the knowledge base and preparing and disseminating more tools, we will, and part of the preparation of that is us just kind of getting better at using and doing analysis of the monitoring data that many of you, if you're from an implementing partner, you're collecting this data about your projects on an ongoing basis, no matter whether it's evaluated or not. But kind of from those that are USAID funded, where does that go? And so we want to be clearer starting from the projects that we already fund or the recently completed, isolating what are the intervention types that we've invested in and what have been the results, and start to try to consolidate this and do some synthetic analysis. And in terms of another area of work that's going to be very interesting, and we're maybe 25% in or so, that's probably being optimistic, but is looking at the ways that we measure youth development assets or soft skills, such as problem solving and collaboration and communication skills and all the kind of behavioral and interpersonal relations that we know that are under kind of that broad domain of soft skills. So there are many different frameworks for even describing these skills. There's been entire analyses of frameworks for these skills. And then there are also many tools that are out there, both domestically and internationally. So we've done JBS has helped us collect 60-some surveys, domestic and international, and we've reviewed them and with a small expert panel and identified at least 5 and maybe 10 that are worthy of greater consideration. And so the notion is that maybe if we find some that might work well internationally, that we could start to begin to use some of the same tools and thereby be able to consolidate our results. And then I see we'll probably do a symposium of some kind in the winter, and we do want to have the results of this be broadly available. And many of you in the room, your organizations have offered these tools to us, so we appreciate that. 2 studies back to this question about systems and sustainability and scale. We've conducted, we're doing sort of experimental studies around how programs become sustainable and how they achieve scale. The first one we did was in Rwanda around the Akazi Kanosi program. And that hopefully we'll be able to share that soon. And there'll be another one coming up in Haiti on the Idéjeunes project, that many of you know. And then sort of, not to bombard you with too much stuff, but I do want to talk about the youth engagement piece. That's the #1 principle. And not that any of the 7 principles in the youth policy is more important than another, but we did actually put it as the top principle because it's the area that's the greatest challenge for us in part. the notion of truly listening to youth and having them participate in this development process that we're in. So we have asked JBS to help us do some case studies of how different organizations engage youth, what kinds of methodologies are they using, what's working well, because we want to be able to change a little bit of the culture within USAID. It is a government agency, and there are certain kind of firewalls and ways of doing things, but we think that we can productively have youth be involved in decision making and providing input, both at Washington and at the country level. So that will be available in the coming months. And there are many ways that we've been engaging youth already at the country level, including it's become pretty routine now to have youth participate on youth assessments that are happening in preparation for projects. So not just flying in, the international experts or even just sourcing, researchers in country, but having youth act as assessors, equal standing on teams. And another area where it's a kind of a different take is we have the Higher Education Solutions Network, which has created 8 innovation labs from the higher education community. Has one of them, at least one, and there may be more I need to find out, have created what they call translational scholars, so having the students from the university be involved on in the innovation lab in developing the research questions that will involve grants as well in various topics. So there's one on food security, for example. And so we're thinking that this is a way for U.S. college students, university students, to connect with students in the developing world as well. And okay, so let me just, there are many other examples that maybe that will come out in your questions. And I just wanted to close by saying that we have been working, the donors have been meeting for at least 5 years at this conference, and we've been moving very slowly towards greater collaboration. And I think that this will be very important as the field becomes stronger, as the clarion cry for paying attention to youth employment becomes larger. It becomes more important for us to work collectively and to be able to begin to align our incentives, our indicators for measurement of success, and our learning agendas. And I think that's going to be a healthy development for the field. So I'm positive about that. So let me stop here, and I will let Kristin talk about some challenges that we're facing in a little more depth, and then we'll be able to have a discussion. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm Kristin O'Planick. I am also in the E3 Bureau, but I am in the MPEP office, which has a very long mouthful name, Micro Enterprise and Private Enterprise Promotion, basically one of the economic growth offices. And as Claire mentioned, our office has been doing a lot more collaboration with Claire's team on workforce development and youth issues in the last, year and a half or so. And it's been great because the two different perspectives do together bring a much more holistic picture and hopefully get us closer to solutions at some point. So kind of thinking from our perspective in my office and what we're thinking about in terms of youth, given this collaboration and coordination with the workforce team, and thinking about the fact that within the agency, if you haven't noticed, there is much more of an appetite of late for a learning culture. and trying to be more deliberate about seeking that collaboration, getting input, examples, lessons coming from the field, really understanding what emerging good practice is. And that's part of what we wanted to get out of this today, that chance to interface and make sure that that dialogue and those feedback loops continue to be happening, and why I wanted to kind of throw out there 3 things, big topics, that don't have easy answers, but things that we want to make sure are still on your radar, that we are all challenging ourselves with and trying to do better on. So the first would be challenges in mainstreaming youth. What really are the emerging best practices for mainstreaming youth across our development portfolio? We know this is something that we want to do given the youth policy. We know it's something that you're starting to see in your RFPs. My typical work is value chains, enterprise development, entrepreneurship. So that's kind of my examples will probably all come from that perspective. So I see all these RFPs for value chain projects now that say, it must integrate gender and youth. So everywhere where it was gender, now it's gender and youth. And I don't know that we necessarily have really good answers yet as to how exactly to do that. I think we have a lot of ideas, a lot of things people are trying and experimenting with, but we need to make sure that we're kind of collecting what's coming out of that so that we can coalesce around good practice. And I like to think about, now that it is gender and youth, what can we learn from our years of trying to mainstream gender, succeeding in some places and failing in others? What of that might be applicable? What tools and approaches from gender might be applicable to our work with youth? I think some of them probably very much are, and others maybe not so much. But I don't think we've really been thoughtful about that to date and really seen where can we pull from and maybe skip some of the failures we had with gender at the beginning and do better with youth. And I know that, again, back to value chains, some of the things that I've seen are really kind of looking for, let's analyze the value chain and figure out what the key entry points for youth might be. But part of me feels like that's not really the answer. I don't know this. We don't necessarily have the evidence for that yet. But deep down inside, shouldn't youth be everywhere throughout that value chain, everywhere within that market system? If we're really talking about resilience and continuity of that system and strengthening it over time, we should have youth and their perspectives and the value that they add throughout, not be focused and emphasizing particular entry points. Now, of course, there are trade-offs there with customization versus kind of the mass production of the work that we do, and you have to find the balance. But are we thinking critically about that? Are we going to see the rise of the youth specialist on all of our project teams? For years we've had the gender specialist, who often was the token female on the team. Often local staff. Are we going to see something similar for youth? To date, what I've seen is that the gender specialist is now the gender and youth specialist. I'm not sure that's effective. Maybe the youth specialist should be an actual youth on the team. I don't know that I've seen that yet. Thoughts that I have. Okay, so that was my first thing to think about, and we're going to be really interested to see what you have to say when we turn the mic over here in a few minutes. Second thing, setting realistic expectations and really understanding the trade-offs. Now, we are just as guilty as any one of this. You see the RFPs where the target is to reach 1 million youth. What is really going to be accomplished is something very low level, farming people through easy training, short training. What is really the depth and sustainability of that impact? I think at this point we know not much. But we, as the donor, need to be setting realistic expectations for our implementing partners. And then that needs to trickle down another layer so that the implementing partners are putting out realistic expectations among the youth that we're trying to work with. This is something I think I worry about more, that we don't have enough clarity in our objectives, that one, we're targeting the right youth, that we're not just going out scattershot, that we're addressing those nuances, that we know we're proposing the right intervention for the right context, kind of like Claire was getting at with doing better diagnostics and knowing, is training youth really going to make a difference? If that's not truly the constraint to the unemployment issue, why should we be wasting our time doing that? We need to really think about the binding constraints and be very much more purposeful and clear in what we're trying to do. And then making sure that the youth know what they're getting into and that we're paying attention to the risk, especially when we talk about entrepreneurship. And I would very much like to thank our colleague from ILO, Drew, shout out to you, for bringing up in a session, I guess it was 2 days ago now, time flies, that there are necessity entrepreneurs and there are opportunity entrepreneurs. They don't necessarily benefit from the same interventions. They don't necessarily have the same needs. And we need to really be careful. We all know being an entrepreneur takes a very good risk appetite. We don't know that that's really getting communicated to the youth. If we're saying this is a great opportunity, pursue it, are we making them understand the risk and the trade-offs of trying to pursue that opportunity? A colleague was telling me the other day, every now and then State Department brings some people in from whatever country, and they come through and have a round table with us, and we talk about things. And there was a youth representative in a delegation from a country I'm not going to name that said a USAID program had convinced her to pursue her business idea. And she was really excited, and it was really great, and she left a job to do it, to become a job creator, a job maker, not a job seeker. And now her business is failing. And she said, no one told me that I might fail. And especially in places where we're doing interventions of this sort to try to help with issues of instability, our stabilization portfolio, there really is a risk there if we're putting out the message that we're going to help you get jobs. We are not. We cannot control that. We can make you more employable, but we cannot guarantee you employment. And that's a very important distinction. So being realistic, that was the second one. And then the last one, in the plenary yesterday, Jim was talking about this a lot, complexity, which Claire just mentioned too. But really, how do we deal with issues of complexity? We all know youth are not homogenous. We all know that they are not only operating in a market system that is very nuanced to where it is, but they are operating within a household dynamic, a household system where risk is being imparted out. And Maya got to some of these points in her own personal story where certain children are designated as the ones to do certain things. And that is how the household is hedging its risk and how it is trying to address its needs. And we cannot just assume that youth have full agency over what they are doing. That would be a very Western paradigm to be putting on all the places where we work. But so we know and we all know these things, but I think because complexity is big and scary and can be paralyzing when you think too much about it, that we tend to try to come up still with these simple answers. And for every complex problem, there is a very simple solution that is wrong. So how can we keep that complexity in mind, but yet at the same time target in, hone in, so that we don't get paralyzed by that complexity, but can still be more purposeful in how we're targeting in the more simple things that we can do so that it might have a bigger systemic effect. And these are huge, huge challenges. As I hope most of you know, the PPL in our bureau, in our agency, is really promoting CLA, collaborating, learning, and adapting, which I think is very important. And you're probably seeing that in a lot of RFPs lately, too, that now we want everybody to be buying into the CLA approach. And I think that helps with this complexity issue. And I think the more that we can pull in that direction where we are really working together, and with other donor projects too. A couple weeks ago, my office signed an MOU with DFID and SDC around market systems value chain work so that we are going to more purposefully collaborate. We're very excited about that. And of course, youth will be an issue within that umbrella. But really looking how can we operationalize some of these concepts around adaptive management that we've been talking about for a long time, and I know that many of you are very interested in these things, but we need concrete examples of how does it work on the ground? How can we get other people to do it? It's one thing to put out the theory, it's another to put out some concrete guidance. And there is a team working, you'll be happy to know, as of late, that is now very purposefully looking for those concrete examples and working with our contracting officers to try to figure out how can we make our contracts capable of allowing for adaptive management practices. But this is, again, where we need that feedback loop from you guys to make sure we're getting it right when we do make these changes. And I think I'm going to stop there. Now, I've sat in several sessions in this room, and I know that there's a competing microphone over here off and on, and I know that in the Q&A it's been very difficult to hear. So I think we would like to encourage people with questions or comments, things that they'd like to say, to come up and use the mic so that everyone can hear you. And there are people online, too. We don't want to forget them. So that everyone can be heard. And we also have other USAID colleagues in the room, so I mean, the three of us are happy to try to respond to things, but we also would like to rely on our other colleagues that are out there for things that you may know more about than we do, because the three of us don't have every answer, and we will gladly tell you when we don't. So please, somebody who has a question, a comment, something they'd like to share, come on up.
It's intimidating, and it coming all the way up to the front. Sorry about that.
Like attached to the floor.
Yeah, it's okay. So this actually came up in the last session I attended about having social capital building for young girls and women. And we had in our group discussion, we talked about how basically any kind of youth economic program or any kind of youth program is going to involve opening up some certain amount of risk for youth, because you're going to expose them to a number of actors who could potentially exploit or take advantage of the youth. So I was wondering about how USAID builds in kind of risk mitigation measures and child protection measures to ensure that we're not creating projects intended to help youth, but that also can expose them to more risky and dangerous situations.
It's a good question.
So to start with, well, it's going to be a hard answer. Maybe we don't have the full answer to begin with. Part of what we're doing with the youth policy and our implementation is to bring together different people within the agency that are working on this. So, for example, we have our Children in Adversity team. Many of you may have engaged with them. So they have some very clear concerns, principles, et cetera. So we're trying to work closely with them. We're also trying to bring together the gender teams. You mentioned, issues affecting young girls. So we're trying to kind of bring together the youth people with the gender team, with people working on ending child marriage, all of these issue areas, and to start that conversation, which already is a challenge. So I'd say that that's one thing. So to begin the conversation at the headquarters level. And then I think, too, as we try to develop technical guidance and trying to work through this issue that Kristin raised in terms of how do you mainstream youth or how do you integrate youth, it may be identifying key question areas related to youth that you need to ask to do no harm or to fully integrate them. So that could be an idea. And if any of you already have things like that, I think it's really important to share it with us, and we can help to facilitate that dialogue. I know in the peace building space that there are a number of partners, donors, and implementing partners that are working on developing principles. I won't speak too much to that because I'm still learning about it. So I think, firstly, we have to understand what are those risks, maybe look at key questions to ask as you go through the design process. I do think case examples are really important. Everyone always hears mention of the Yes Youth Can program in Kenya, but I listened to young people from that program describing how they very intentionally incorporated gender issues and concerns for young girls into that program. So I think we need to kind of get more of a sense of what's out there, develop some principles, or that's just my initial take on it, but we'd be welcome to other people's ideas on how we can better do that. I don't know if anyone else wants to try to address that.
No, I would just make there's the other side too, which is that youth, as they are, quote, prior to our intervention, are not without risk. There's risk to being out of school. There's risk to being in school. So it's really knowing what the risks are in different contexts. So.
Actually, just to add another really quick point, too, that's not specific to the economic opportunities space, but because I'm in the democracy, human rights, and governance area, that's of particular concern to me, because I think a lot of our programs that are working in sensitive environments with young people, elections, et cetera, political participation, it's all about engaging young people, but because we know that their brains are, still developing, sometimes they're more willing to take risks. So I'm very interested in that issue related to that space. Of course, it's relevant across sectors as well. The other thing that I would mention, too, is we're talking about use of mobile technology, use of social media. I'm involved in a project in Jordan that's working on civic participation through gaming for young people, but really thinking through, when we use these ICT technologies, what does that mean? And young people might be posting things. So I think we really, as a community, need to look carefully at issues of privacy, but also of risk related to these technologies as well.
No other questions? Please, come on up. No, because there are people online trying to listen to you. They're very eager to hear what you have to say.
But you can line up if you like.
Yes, I mean, that's fine. We've got space up here, probably more than you have back there.
Hi, I wanted to thank you for mentioning complexity and adaptive management, and also thank you for putting on the table the importance of donor coordination and also the contracting element that's involved. That's really encouraging to hear. I think that when you talk about complexity and you talk about youth in particular, one of my, you see this now, it's beginning to become more prevalent, this notion of taking something to scale. When you're working with youth programming in particular, taking something to scale requires so many different actors and with so many different interests that it's really critical to be able to pull in other donors and encourage contractors to work together. And one suggestion might be to think about it in an incentive-based approach. Rather than trying to figure out what the contractual connections might be. Really, the other term I would use is leveraging, allowing different donors and different contractors and different constituencies to really leverage work that has been done in a different sector, by a different partner, different donor, and build on it and count that, not in terms of, find a way to make that work, because that's how you're going to get to scale. So.
Other questions? Comments? We're going to put you on the spot if you don't stand up and ask us.
This is just a quick comment to encourage you and thank you for wanting to take the lead in this space of measuring life skills. I think it's really important. I know UNESCO is really interested in this, and a lot of us are very keen on finding better tools, something that moves beyond the sort of the self-assessment, and based on the myriad frameworks out there, and finding some ways where we can have a little bit more commonality. But to that end, I would also really strongly encourage you to make this as open a process as possible, to invite many actors in, maybe at some point when you're ready to have a conference or something like that where many people can come and include their voices and talk about, once JBS gets some of the initial work done and there's really something to react to, I think it'd be great. A lot of us are keen on seeing that work being done, but we would like to be involved in it as well.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, I'm sorry to have to ask you this question, but in terms of the youth IQC, just to give us some sense of where it is, how it's going, what's going on, as sorry to ask, just felt like had to do it. Thank you.
I think the answer to that is it's procurement sensitive. Nice try.
Kristin, one thing we can say is that, what was it, how many months ago, maybe June or so. There is publicly available. There is, for those in the room that may not know about it, there is the draft scope of work is available there, so you can catch up.
Online people can't hear you. We always forget they're there because they're in the ether.
I was just curious about, you had mentioned at the beginning in terms of some of the global agenda for youth programming, you'd mentioned the post-2015 process and specifically the SDGs. It's been very unclear, based on the reports and things that have come out from the UN, if there is going to be a focus and what it would be. But of course, it's a burning question. So I don't know if you can elaborate at all about how some of those discussions are going and what you anticipate might come out. Is there going to be a global goal? Will there be a process? You know, I know it's still all up in the air, but any forecasts would be very interesting. Thank you.
That will be very difficult for me to answer, really. All I can say is that internally within USAID, obviously there's a whole process with the USG and all the different stakeholders involved. There was the report that came out. It's really hard for me to say and not to get ahead of anyone. I know that there's the major group on children and youth that are trying to advance this issue. There are still stakeholders trying to argue for a goal. Most people say, oh, that may not happen, but looking at how you integrate it. So I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone, but I have been involved in some of those conversations with some of the stakeholder groups. So we'll see. I think it's important. It's really impressive to see that there is attention to youth issues. There's a huge effort by a number, the UN in particular, and really pushing to get youth engagement, and they're encouraging them to continue to do this in the process. But my own observation is more feedback, specific feedback from the field in terms of what people would like to see, be it targets, language. The children and adversity group, I think, has that pretty down. But I know that from conversations with some of the stakeholder groups, external ones, they haven't yet really indicated what specifically they would like to see. And again, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, please correct me, but I think it's really helpful. The more detail that people can put forward, the better. So remains to be seen. I think that people still need to engage in the process, and so sorry for that unsatisfactory response. But
thank you. I also want to say thank you for mentioning something, the whole concept of systems thinking and the approach to this. We have the privilege of being one of the implementers for Yes, Youth Can in Kenya, and it seems as if that was one of the most brilliant things that was done. There was a space created for a holistic approach to be learned about. The first year, I understand, I'm new to the process, but I understand the first year was a little savage. And after learning had occurred, then some things worked out. So I guess this is also one of those questions. How far along are those discussions coming? We've been given to understand from a variety of people inside and outside of USAID that the possibility of doing something like that again is felt to be rather remote, given the inertia and the habits and the culture within USAID. So is there a resistance, or is this something that more and more people are seeing it really is the way to try to go in the future? Thanks.
Yeah, at the time that Yes Youth Can was created, and I also, I had actually wanted to just mention it as one of the only, I would say at-scale youth engagement projects, and it's kind of more than a project. It's almost a mobilization, a movement that we have, where youth engagement is cooked into the very nature of the project. And I think there was probably you probably did a session at the conference already, so maybe folks have heard about it. And you're right, there were some very specific sort of factors that kind of came into alignment. And one of them was the political, the instability in the country as a result of the post-election violence, and then there was also the response from Congress, which gave us quite a bit of resources in a large lump sum to work with, and then so those kind of conditions, and then Kenya itself, I think, is a country that we can kind of more easily work with. We have, there's lots of money available for Afghanistan. You could imagine in your happy dreams all the great things that could have been done, right? but because of that country context, it's not really possible. So I think that's just an important thing to watch for. I don't see anything on the horizon, though. Then that's one of these things that we can't really predict. But that's the unpredictability. The preparation part, though, was that part of what went into designing the program the way it was, which was with enough openness and flexibility so youth could be fully engaged in that way, came because we conducted what we call kind of generically a cross-sectoral youth assessment, where we went out and talked to youth, listened to them very carefully about what their perceptions were of, folks who we thought had been the good guys, the NGOs that were working on their behalf, that they, in the end, didn't feel were fully representing their interests. So that process of listening, the process of having people from different sectors on the assessment team, those were all those were kind of our being prepared, and we had conducted a number of these assessments in other countries before. So having those tools and being prepared with those approaches, I think, is critical, so that if we do have an opportunity, like the conditions leading up to Yes Youth Can, we can take advantage of that.
I think that there's a lot of, challenges obviously related to the cross-cutting nature, cross-sectoral programming, and that's what we're trying to address. I think that the youth space is really exciting because people have been doing that for a while, and so just being able to get more examples, especially of evidence-based programming, evaluations in this space to make the case to other sectors. We're trying to do it, and even with really good intentioned people, it can be very hard because of the bureaucratic pressures. So we are raising this issue within the agency. We're trying to look at how do you deal with this. We have our system for tracking programs, but it's hard to know because of how the programs are reported on. So we're trying to look at things within the system that we could change, that we can influence to help facilitate that. I do think that there are a lot of aspects of Yes Youth Can and some of the components of that we could integrate. And so it's a matter of sharing that with other missions. Some other missions are indeed trying to do more engagement with youth. So there's a lot of promise there, probably more discussion on what can we bring if we don't have those huge amounts of money, what else can we do? I think that's really important. And if people have suggestions, based on where you're sitting and the engagement you've had with USAID and things that we can improve to kind of move this agenda forward, we're definitely all ears. So we do have committed people within the agency that are working on this. There's more attention to these issues, but it is very difficult. It's a very big challenge.
And don't forget, we have earmarks that prevent us from doing what we would like to do. For example, Nigeria, 96% of its budget is earmarked. What do you do with that? And in terms of the systems thinking, more specifically, there definitely is a cohort within the agency that is very interested in getting more of that out there, doing more of that internally, trying to make that more part of our day-to-day. For example, at the beginning of July, we had a private sector officer training for a week where we had 75 field officers come in from the different missions around the world, and we had a systems thinking workshop within that training. So it is something we're trying, but these things take time.
So I'm Lyndon Rago. I'm from the Center for Creative Leadership. We're relatively new to this space, but one of the things that I hear is this interest in systems thinking and complexity, which is an area that we focus on. But there's also a high desire for proven methods and a lot of evaluation. And there's need in these systems for emergence and bottom-up and a lot of experimentation to find ways. And it seems like I don't see as much funding available for some of those practices for innovation. When you all have put it out, as far as I know, they tend to be oversubscribed. So any thinking about how you can put more funds towards experimental, small, innovative efforts as well as the large scale-out efforts?
Sure. I know that there are pockets of that definitely going on. The agency has what's called Development Innovation Ventures, which is explicitly a fund that exists to try to, see what really experimental things that are going to be evaluated and get rigor behind them and try to see what can emerge from that. So that is one particular thing. And that's open globally to almost anything. So it's not geared towards a specific sector or an area. And just in terms of some of our programming, I know within value chains and market systems work, we definitely always want to try to let things emerge and experiment because you don't know how the system is going to respond to what activities you're doing. And we're very much promoting that people use a facilitation approach where instead of directly doing things, you're kind of poking at different places in the system and to see how it reacts and then working with that. Because the thing we need to acknowledge too is that none of these systems are static. So however it is at the beginning of the project, even though you lay out this what might be perfect plan, by the time you get it into implementation, the system has already changed. So you need to really be paying attention to that. And we're also trying to develop within that group better ways to do monitoring and evaluation around this type of work to how can you capture those systemic changes and know that they're happening when you know that you want the end goal to be up here, but to get there, we know is not a linear path, and we might go this way, and we might go that way, and we might circle back, and as long as we know we're generally getting towards that direction, can we be okay with being flexible in our monitoring along the way? But this gets back to some of those contractual issues. So we are thinking actively about these things and trying to sort them out where we can, but that's not going to be answered tomorrow.
Well, I would just say, we had, when we were working on the youth policy, we did think about whether we wanted to do some kind of innovation grant making. And I think we still do. It's just a question of getting some, kind of doing things in sequence and getting things going. So I do hope that that will happen. I think it probably will. But the first priority was kind of get the policy out. And the next push is get the implementation guidance out and the approach out, and then I think that we could see that. So,
you have something else to say? All right, I think we have time for one last question or comment. Anybody with something burning? No. Okay. Well, we hope that this was informative and helpful and get you thinking. And please do be in touch with us. We want to know what's happening in the field. We need to know what's happening in the field. Thank you.